Hello my friends and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 tier list and guide. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're continuing my ultimate updated guide to spells, the second half of the level 3 spells, and thanks to a quirk of the alphabet, this is just non-stop bangers. I've already gone over the rating system and definitions of the tiers when talking about the level 1 spells, so we'll just hop right into it. But before I begin, I do want to take a quick moment to say thank you so much to Eduardo Franco for the €5 donation, Nubidir for the £2, Lucas Tomsu for the 250 krona, and Micro123 and Intention for becoming channel members. Thank you so much, my friends. I really appreciate your support. Alright, let's talk some of the best spells in the game. We're going to start with one of the most discussed spells in the game, Haste. Haste is a concentration buff spell. You cast it on an ally or yourself, and the creature that you target gets, for 10 turns, +2 armor class, advantage on dexterity saving throws, 30 feet of extra movement speed, and an extra action every single turn. Now, the haste action is actually kind of funny because it works completely differently in tabletop D&D than it does in Baldur's Gate 3, and it works differently in Baldur's Gate 3 depending on the difficulty mode that you're playing on. In tabletop D&D, haste only lets you make one extra attack each turn or a movement option like a dash or a disengage. In Baldur's Gate 3, it lets you do a lot more than that, so the spell has been significantly buffed compared to its tabletop version. On Tactician mode or lower, the haste action works exactly the same as any other action. You can cast a spell with it. You can make an entire extra attack with it, including, if you have the extra attack feature, multiple attacks. A hasted fighter at level 11 or higher can make 6 attacks per turn, or 9 if they use Action Surge, which adds a ridiculous number of extra attacks to your party. Being able to cast 2 fully leveled spells per turn is also incredibly powerful. A lot of burst damage spells, like fireballs, do a lot better if you cast multiple of them in a turn because you're much more likely to fry every enemy in an encounter. It basically, on Tactician mode or lower, is like adding a whole extra party member to your party because giving a character an extra action just doubles their effectiveness. And like I said in my previous review of Haste, 2 Karlax plays just as well in-game as it would on Tumblr, so you can see how this is an incredibly powerful spell. On Honor mode, it works a little bit differently. When you're making an attack with the hasted action, you can only ever make one attack, even if you have extra attack. But you can still cast spells, perform movement options, or do anything else that requires an action, like throwing an item or reactivating a spell like Call Lightning. All of those you can still do with haste on Honor mode. So while it is a little worse for weapon attackers, it still provides a ton of additional value for any character that is mostly not attacking with weapons or makes only one attack per turn. It's also still just very good for weapon attackers. One extra attack per turn is still excellent. When you strip all the colored lights and fancy words away, Baldur's Gate 3 combat is really just about one thing: increasing the ratio of actions that you take to actions that your opponents take. There's a lot of ways that you can accomplish this. You can kill enemies before they act, you can lock them down with control spells, or you can increase the number of actions that your party takes, and haste is the most direct way to do that. So it is the most direct and one of the most powerful ways to accomplish the main thing that you are trying to do when playing Baldur's Gate 3. It fundamentally works so well with the basic strategic plan of what you're attempting to do in the game that it is an invaluable tool. Now, there are a couple downsides to haste. One is that it's a concentration spell, so you can have your concentration broken. And when a character becomes unhasted, when they lose haste, i.e. by having the spell cancelled, concentration broken, or just by having it expire, they get the lethargic condition for 1 turn, which stuns them and prevents them from acting. Having your haste caster drop concentration at an inopportune moment can be pretty dangerous. So you need to be a little careful with positioning or use spells like Sanctuary or Invisibility in order to keep that character safe while they're hasting your other party members. There is also the Potion of Speed, which exists in the game, which duplicates the effect of haste. So you will sometimes see people say that you don't need to actually cast the haste spell, you can just use Potions of Speed instead. I disagree with this. Potions of Speed are a relatively valuable resource. And Haste is an incredibly powerful tool. The fact that you can cast it before combat starts and have 10 turns of extra actions for the entirety of a combat without having to spend a single action during combat is incredibly powerful. The spell itself is going to last even for longer combats, although it will also shorten combats significantly because of how powerful it is. So you still do, I think, want to cast the spell. It's especially good for sorcerers who can twin spell it and get 2 copies of Haste for a single spell cast. But even characters who aren't sorcerers can still make tremendous use of this spell to duplicate your actions. The best characters to cast Haste on in Honor mode are characters who whose actions are extremely valuable and who are usually not doing things like weapon attacks, although putting it on a fighter is still really good. Just giving them an extra attack every single turn is also still excellent. But putting it on a warlock lets them double up on Eldritch Blasts. Putting it on a character who's concentrating on per turn effects like Call Lightning lets them double up on those. So those are your best targets, but really you can just slap Haste down on anyone in your party and it will be tremendously powerful. This spell directly affects the action economy, the most important thing in the game. It also gives you a bunch of really nice defensive buffs, obviously S tier. Hunger of Hadar. Hunger of Hadar is a warlock battlefield control spell. Cast it on the ground and it creates a 20-foot radius area of difficult terrain in which enemies are blinded with no saving throw, so just like Fog Cloud or Darkness. And creatures that start their turn in it take 2d6 cold damage. Creatures that end their turn in it take 2d6 acid damage with a dexterity saving throw to negate. Now, the dex save is bugged and always uses a save DC of 12 rather than the caster's DC, so the acid damage usually won't go off from Hunger of Hadar, but it will still happen sometimes, and the effects of the spell are so powerful regardless that even including that bug, the spell is still incredible. This is a huge area of a no-save, blind, and consistent damage. It's cold damage, so wet enemies are going to take double damage. It's difficult terrain, so it's really hard for enemies to get out of the Hunger of Hadar. And because they're blinded, they can't jump out of it. A character that's blinded can't target anything further than melee range from itself, and jump requires them to target a space on the ground. So, unlike a lot of other battlefield control spells, Hunger of Hadar forces enemies to stay inside it and use their actual movement speed to get back out. Once they do that, which is often going to take them multiple turns, especially if you combine it with something like plant growth to slow them down even further, you can see my my recent video, The Most Underrated Spells in Baldur's Gate 3, for an example of this in practice. You can often just push them back in. Most warlocks are going to have Repelling Blast, which is an easy way to shove enemies around, and most parties will have at least one strength character with a good athletics check, so you can push enemies just right back into the Hunger of Hadar once they finally make their way out of it. This is one of the easiest ways to just shut down an entire encounter. Slapping Hunger of Hadar down on top of another battlefield control spell is just fight winning on pretty much every fight where enemies are not immune to blind. You get consistent damage, they stay stuck forever, and you just keep them shoved into the Hunger of Hadar while peppering them with ranged attacks and pushing them back in if they happen to manage to escape. Hunger of Hadar is such a game-changing spell that it, alongside Counterspell, are, in my opinion, the two spells that, as a lore bard with magical secrets, which is one of the most powerful abilities in the game to choose any spell, those are the two spells you're most likely to choose. So this spell is just absolutely top tier. When compared to almost any other spell in the game, it's one of the ones that you're most likely to grab with an ability that lets you get that. That should give you some idea of just how good this spell is. Hunger of Hadar on top of any other control effect or damaging effect will just win a fight outright. So, of course, S tier. Hypnotic Pattern. Hypnotic Pattern is an AoE control spell. It's concentration based and has a 30-foot radius and a 60-foot range. So you can hit enemies up to 90 feet away with it, and it's 60 feet across in terms of the area of effect, so you'll almost always be able to hit a whole encounter, or all but like one enemy, with Hypnotic Pattern. Enemies inside the Hypnotic Pattern have to make a Wisdom saving throw, or they become incapacitated for 2 turns. It works similar to Sleep, where they can be woken up when they take damage or by an ally who uses the help or shove action on them. So you will have to try to hit the entire encounter with Hypnotic Pattern, otherwise the enemies are going to wake themselves up. But if you do hit the entire encounter, then for 2 turns they can't do anything, and you can just wake them up one at a time by killing them. Obviously, being able to shut down an entire encounter in a gigantic radius is an incredibly powerful tool. It's just 1 wisdom save for 2 full turns of disable. They don't get another save to get out of it. So in any fight where you can catch the entire group of enemies in Hypnotic Pattern, it's going to be the best control spell available. I'm going to give it A tier because Hypnotic Pattern, Fear, and Sleet Storm are all control spells that lock down entire encounters. They each have their use in different encounters, so you usually won't be using just one of these in every single encounter, but you will probably use one of the 3 in almost every single encounter, so you're going to want all of them for your party. Hypnotic Pattern just wins fights, A tier. Lightning Arrow. So no matter where we put this spell, it's going to break the very pleasing symmetry that we've developed so far, so I'm already kind of biased against it. Lightning Arrow is a level 3 ranger spell, so you don't get it until you are character level 9 as a ranger, and it's a direct damage spell. You make a ranged spell attack roll, so that's going to use your wisdom as a ranger, which probably means it's less likely to hit unless you've built a very high wisdom ranger. And if that attack hits, then the primary target of the lightning arrow takes 4d8 lightning damage, which is not terrible damage for a 3rd level spell slot, but isn't that exciting either. Then, they and everything within a 10-foot radius has to make a dexterity saving throw against 2d8 lightning damage, so against the primary target it can be up to 6d8 if they fail, and if they succeed the save they still take half damage. Everything within the explosion will always go off, even if you miss the initial attack. It's also worth noting that the initial attack doesn't show up in the combat log. Sometimes you'll just see this spell not do damage for no reason. That's why. It's because you missed the initial attack against the enemy, and then the 4d8 damage didn't go off. So basically, you are using this spell to have a low chance of doing a medium amount of damage to one single target, and then do a really bad fireball at enemies that have to be centered around that single target. The amount of damage that this spell does is simply not worth a 3rd level spell slot, and it's extremely unreliable because your save DC and your chance to hit are both going to be pretty low on a ranger at level 9, unless you've done a very unusual build where you're maxing wisdom on a ranger. And you're a ranger, you have weapon attacks. If you want to do direct damage to an enemy, just hit them. Shoot them with your bow or hit them with your sword. Casting Lightning Arrow is almost certainly going to do less damage than just making weapon attacks, cost you a 3rd level spell slot, and probably won't hit in the first place because your save DC is really low. This is a damage spell that is weak, unreliable, and poor damage, D tier. Lightning Bolt. Lightning Bolt is an area direct damage spell. It shoots in a 100-foot line originating from the caster, and everything within that line takes 8d6 lightning damage with a dexterity saving throw for half. That's the same damage as Fireball, so 28 average damage, but it's lightning damage, so in Baldur's Gate 3, enemies who are wet will take double damage from it. And many fewer enemies resist lightning damage than fire damage, so generally speaking, it's going to be a better damage type. Funnily enough, the 100-foot line from Lightning Bolt extends a little bit behind the caster and is 5 feet wide, which makes it almost exactly the same square footage that it covers as Fireball. Fireball is a 13-foot radius circle, or about 530 square feet, and Lightning Bolt is a 500 and a bit foot line, so about 500 square feet. So they actually cover almost exactly the same amount of ground, just in very, very different shapes. It's a little harder to get lots of enemies in the Lightning Bolt than it is Fireball, but it also has longer range, which can be relevant in some arenas, and if you move to line up enemies, or if enemies have moved in a line towards you, then Lightning Bolt will sometimes be easier to hit multiple enemies in. In particular, if you've started a fight by backing up, which is not an unreasonable thing to do if you have a lot of spellcasters, and enemies have moved towards you, they'll often move towards you and form into a line, because many encounters have enemies with different movement speeds, and then you'll be able to hit the entire encounter with the lightning bolt. So while usually you're going to hit like slightly fewer total enemies than Fireball, in practice it will be very similar, and the damage type is much better, and it's got much longer range, so you can use this in a lot of encounters where you can't use Fireball. If you want a direct damage spell, Lightning Bolt, I think, is just the better choice in general. It's going to hit the same number, or in some cases, even more enemies. It does much better damage, and of course, you have the wet condition to multiply the damage. It also has a lot of synergies with things that care about lightning damage, like reverberation charges and so on. So Lightning Bolt is going to be the better choice for direct damage for the characters that can cast it. I'm going to give it A tier. I think you still probably won't use Lightning Bolt in every encounter, but if you just need to blow up a bunch of enemies, this is usually the best way to do it. So A tier is perfect for Lightning Bolt. Mass Healing Word. Mass Healing Word is Healing Word, but it hits everybody within a 60-foot radius instead of just one target. Still only takes your bonus action and heals them for 1d4 plus your spellcasting modifier, plus any additional bonuses that you have on healing, so it's a great AoE way to apply all of the buff on heal items. Mass Healing Word is usually not going to be used for the actual healing effect, although if you have had multiple characters get knocked unconscious, Mass Healing Word will bring them both back to their feet. But mostly is just going to be used as a way to reapply the buff on healing items in a giant AoE. It's 60-foot radius around the caster, so it is extremely likely to hit your entire party, including summons and stuff like that. So you can end up with a decent amount of healing value out of this, but mostly this spell only exists to apply those buffs. Those buffs are incredibly powerful, and a lot of Honor Mode parties are going to have a character using the Hellrider's Pride and the Whispering Promise to apply them, and Mass Healing Word is the best way to apply them, so for any party with a dedicated healer, this is going to be a mandatory spell. It also works very well with other effects that increase your healing, like Life Domain Cleric, or for dedicated healers to be able to boost their entire party's hit points dramatically, because this is a bonus action and you can do something else on your turn. So, although this is very expensive spell slot-wise, in terms of action economy, it's a very low cost, and you're going to end up using this in a lot of fights that go long to add a little bit of healing, get downed party members back on their feet, and reapply the buffs to your entire party. Mass Healing Word is certainly less versatile and impactful than Healing Word because it costs a level 3 spell slot instead of a level 1, and that's a tremendously higher cost, but you're definitely going to use this spell a lot, so A tier. Next up, Plant Growth. Plant Growth is a ground-targeted battlefield control spell. It does not take your concentration, unlike most battlefield control spells, and has a 20-foot radius in which everything has its movement speed reduced to 1/4. 1/4 movement speed basically means that most enemies can't move, so if you have some way to keep them from jumping out of the plant growth, melee enemies are completely shut down by this spell. Conveniently, you'll notice that a 20-foot radius with a 60-foot range is exactly the same as Hunger of Hadar, so layering plant growth underneath Hunger of Hadar is one of the easiest ways to just win an encounter outright. For an example of this in practice, you can see my video, The Most Underrated Spells in Baldur's Gate 3, where I said that plant growth is one of, in my opinion, the 5 most underrated spells in the game. I often see people saying they don't see the use of this spell, but turning off enemies' ability to interact with the party is, of course, extremely powerful, and this does that very, very well. You do have to combine this with another source of damage or some other way to shut down enemy movement, teleportation effects, and jumping. Otherwise, enemies will often be able to jump out. But against enemies that can't jump, either because they naturally can't jump or because you've blinded them with Fog Cloud or Hunger or Darkness, Plant Growth will absolutely shine. Melee enemies will be completely incapable of interacting with you. Ranged enemies will be stuck inside the blinding clouds for turn after turn after turn. And if they do manage to get out, you can usually just shove them right back in. Plant Growth is also notable in that, of course, it is not concentration. So you can layer this on top of a concentration debuff with the same character, especially with a hasted action. Casting Plant Growth and Hunger of Hadar is very possible for the same character to do in the same turn. Or you can have another character who's concentrating on something, like Haste, cast the Plant Growth while your Warlock casts Hunger of Hadar. and those make incredible combos. There is one major downside of plant growth, which is that it is flammable, and it is very easy for the effects on the ground that are flammable to just be randomly destroyed. Either enemies will do a random bit of fire damage and set it on fire, your party will often have fire damage attached to their weapons or spells, so you have to be careful about what you use, and it's pretty easy to accidentally just put this on top of a torch or area of fire on the ground and just have it catch fire immediately when you cast it, so you do have to be kind of careful with where you place the spell. Plant growth, I think, is going to be excellent in some encounters and not very good in other encounters, because if enemies have fire damage, it mostly won't do anything, and if it's mostly ranged enemies, you won't use plant growth, but when combined with another effect that shuts down enemy movement, against melee enemies, plant growth is unbeatable. I'm going to give it B tier because it does have to be used strategically alongside other spell effects and combined in order to win certain encounters, but plant growth, when it's good, is incredibly good. Protection from Energy. Protection from Energy is a day-long concentration buff spell. You cast it on an ally, and it gives them resistance to an elemental damage type of your choice. So you can choose acid, cold, fire, lightning, or thunder damage, and the creature will take only half damage of any damage of that type. This is obviously very powerful if you're going into an encounter where you're mostly going to be taking one type of damage. Protection from Energy just makes those encounters vastly less dangerous, so taking only half damage from a particular damage type is incredibly strong, of course. So the upside of this spell is very high. Unfortunately, the cost of the spell is also really high. A level 3 spell slot and your concentration mean that the character that is casting this is going to be significantly weakened by losing those resources and not being able to concentrate on anything more powerful for that fight. So only in fights, and it only targets one creature, so only in fights where you're mostly going to be taking entirely one type of damage, and you can Protection from Energy to get the rest of your party resistant to that damage type alongside other sources of resistance, are you usually going to want to cast this spell. There's a lot of ways to passively gain resistance to elemental damage types. Things like the Darkfire Shortbow will give you resistance. There's other spells that don't take your concentration, like Fire Shield, that can give you resistance. And there's, of course, the resistance elixirs, which are very powerful when going into those types of encounters also. So you may not need to actually cast the spell in order to get this effect. But for some encounters, and for some damage types where it's harder to get the resistance elixirs, in particular thunder-themed enemies, it can be very hard to get resistance to thunder damage. Though you can use Silence to make yourself completely immune to thunder damage, so there's still ways to break out of thunder damage. But if you know that you don't have another way to resist a particular damage type, and are going into a fight that features that damage type a lot, Protection from Energy can be a good choice. I'm going to give it C tier because there's just a lot of ways to duplicate this effect for cheaper, but it is a very powerful effect. So if for whatever reason you don't have any other of the ways that you can get it, Protection from Energy can still be pretty useful. You just usually will have another way to get it that is less expensive. Remove Curse. Remove Curse lets you remove a curse. It does exactly what it says in the name. There's a few story events and a couple spells that count as curse. Of course, the Bestow Curse spell is a curse, which you can remove with Remove Curse. And there's also a bunch of story events that can apply curses to your party members, which you will want to remove. A lot of them get removed when you long rest, so you won't always need to actually cast Remove Curse, but there are a few story event curses that do not get removed when you long rest, and this is the way to get rid of them. You obviously won't have this spell prepared most of the time because you can just swap it in whenever you get a curse that you need to actually get rid of, but this is the way to do that when you do want to remove one of those story event curses, which can actually have some pretty debilitating effects. So you will want to cast this at various points in the game when your party is afflicted with whatever conditions it removes. This is, therefore, the perfect example of a C-tier spell. You're going to use it when it comes up, which will be mostly at scripted story event points, and otherwise you will never use it. So the main challenge with Remove Curse is remembering that it exists so that you can use it when appropriate. C-tier for Remove Curse. Revivify. Revivify is a funny spell in Baldur's Gate 3 because it actually works completely differently than it does in tabletop Dungeons & Dragons. In tabletop, you can only use this spell to bring back a character who was killed within the last minute. But in Baldur's Gate 3, it just works on any dead character, so you can bring them back to life, more like the tabletop spell Raise Dead. Bringing a dead character back to life is pretty powerful. If an ally got downed in combat and then the enemies focused them down before it rolled back around to your turn, so you had no chance to get them back on their feet, Revivify can do that for you and get a powerful character able to take actions again. They come back at 1 HP, so of course you have to heal them or find a way to stop them from just getting knocked down again, but this is a reasonable panic button if you are at risk of having a character die in various situations. There's also some things that you can do with Revivify where you can cheese various effects. You can use it to remove curses as well, by just killing the character that the curse is on and then bringing them back to life. It'll remove most curses. And there's a few other ways that you can use Revivify to do some kind of game-breaking nonsense. If you are interested in that, I recommend Proxygate Tactician's videos because he uses a lot of Revivify cheese to do various absurd challenges and things like that. The problem with Revivify as a spell, though, in Baldur's Gate is that out of combat you can always use Withers to do this, and in combat you can always use a scroll to do this. Every character starts with a scroll of Revivify. Vendors have them out the ears. You're going to pick up tons of them just from random loot around the game and from scripted loot that you're going to get. The game doesn't want your characters to die, so it gives you tons and tons of ways to bring them back. So actually casting the spell Revivify is going to be very rare. Only if your characters are dying just constantly throughout your playthrough will you ever come remotely close to running out of scrolls. So you will almost never want to actually use this spell compared to just using a scroll of Revivify. For that reason, I'm going to give it D tier. There's just no reason to cast the actual spell because while the effect can be okay in some circumstances, you just will have it for free on every single character all the time, so you don't need to actually prepare and cast this spell. Next up, Sleet Storm. Sleet Storm is another gigantic area of effect battlefield control spell. Similar in usage to Fear and Hypnotic Pattern, these three spells together make up the trifecta of ways to just shut down an encounter. Sleet Storm creates a 30-foot radius, so a massive radius, area, in which enemies who are caught in it have to make a concentration save or immediately drop concentration on anything they're concentrating on. And then, because it creates an enormous ice surface, everything in it also has to make a dexterity save or fall prone. You can concentrate on this spell for up to 10 turns, keeping the ice surface on the ground, and if the ice surface melts because of being hit by fire damage, you will refresh it at the beginning of each of your turns, so it's less vulnerable to being melted or burned away than most other ground-targeted surfaces. Because the dexterity saving throw or fall prone. Also, if they fall prone, they're going to drop concentration on their spells. This spell is incredibly effective against enemy spellcasters who are concentrating on something, because if they fail either of the saves, they immediately lose concentration on their spell. And then also, this spell is just incredibly effective at shutting down enemies. Knocking enemies prone is really good for a huge number of reasons. Can give you advantage on attacks, can stop their concentration, and is extremely disruptive to enemy plans, also slows them down significantly, and creating an ice surface, as we've discussed numerous times throughout this tier list, is incredibly strong, because when enemies move on their turn, they have to make a dexterity saving throw or fall prone on the ice, and if they fall prone on their turn, they just lose the rest of their turn. So anytime an enemy moves before taking a normal action, Sleet Storm has a chance of just stunning them. A 60-foot across area of effect stun is obviously incredibly powerful, and this spell lasts for 10 turns. And it's fairly hard to disrupt because it's difficult to melt the ice surface and not just have it come back. So even though fire damage can sometimes counter these effects, it's much harder for Sleet Storm to have that happen to it. The downside of Sleet Storm is that for an area of effect stun, it's less reliable than something like Hypnotic Pattern. Because with Hypnotic Pattern, if they fail to save, you know they're out for 2 turns. With Sleet Storm, you have to wait until their turn, and if the enemy chooses to take an action before moving, they might just be able to act as normal and not get stunned. So Sleet Storm is more generally applicable. Unlike Fear, it's extremely long-ranged and a huge area of effect. Unlike Hypnotic Pattern, you can catch only part of an encounter in it, and it's still extremely powerful, whereas Hypnotic Pattern, you mostly need to catch the entire encounter, but there is a chance that enemies just act normally. So these three spells together will have incredible uses in different situations. If you can't hit the entire encounter, Sleet Storm is your best bet. If you can hit the entire encounter, Hypnotic Pattern is your best bet, and Fear is harder to land than either of the other two, but is a worse debuff mostly. So when you can land Fear on a lot of enemies, it's usually going to be your go-to. That's the basic heuristic for deciding between these three spells. Either way, Sleet Storm is an incredibly powerful control spell, especially good against spellcasters, but a 60-foot radius ice surface is just going to make enemies slip and fall, and like half the enemies are just going to skip all of their turns for the next 10 turns, so it's very easy to just outright win an encounter by placing this on the ground. I'm going to give it A tier, and again, for all three of these, I feel like these could easily be S tier spells, but the fact that you will change between the three of them means that I'm going to put them in A tier, but they're all extremely powerful and can all win encounters outright. Next up, Slow. Slow is another control spell, but unlike the area of effect spells, you instead target 6 creatures with it. They have to be within 60 feet of you, but you just choose 6 creatures to target. That has a bunch of advantages because it means that even if your allies would be caught in the AoE of an area of effect spell, you can still use Slow and you'll still be able to hit enemies. How it works is that the enemy has to make a wisdom saving throw, and if they fail it, then they get the opposite of haste applied to them. So their movement speed will be halved instead of doubled, their armor class and dexterity saves will be reduced by 2, and they'll only be able to take either an action or a bonus action, and can't take any reactions. This is very powerful, especially on Honor mode, because a lot of enemies have really solid bonus actions, and on Honor mode, a lot of legendary actions count as reactions, so Slow removing those is really good against certain types of bosses. Slow also, like some of the other debuffs that we've discussed, doesn't get affected by incapacitation immunity, so there's a lot of bosses that you can use Slow against that you can't use something like Command or Hypnotic Pattern against, so it's pretty powerful in those cases as well. Slow has more or less 2 uses, because it's a little bit... also, it prevents... Enemies can only make a single attack per turn while slowed as well, which obviously is really good also, forgot to mention that. Slow has a couple of uses where you would want to use it over another control spell. One where enemies and allies are grouped up really tightly, so an area of effect spell like Hypnotic Pattern or Sleet Storm would catch a bunch of your allies. Slow is still very reliable in those situations. And 2, when enemies are just immune to the incapacitation effects of the more devastating spells, you can still land Slow pretty reliably. It also is very good in boss fights because you can hit the boss with it and then still also get value on a lot of their minions. So if you compare it to something like Tasha's Hideous Laughter, that's only going to hit the one main target, but any adds in that encounter will still be able to act. Slow can debuff all of them pretty significantly. You're mostly only going to use this spell when you can't use one of the more devastating debuffs, because preventing an enemy from doing anything at all with Fear or Hypnotic Pattern is better than limiting them to only a few actions, but there are lots of times where Slow is more usable and more reliable than these other spells. Because it is generally your second choice for a control spell, I'm going to give it B tier, but this is a second choice that is going to happen pretty frequently, so keep this spell in mind for when your other spells are not usable. Next up, Speak with Dead. Speak with Dead allows you to talk with a dead character. So you select a dead body, you use Speak with Dead, and then you can chat with them. They won't talk to you if you were the one who killed them, but you can use Disguise Self to get around that, so it's very easy to just talk with any dead bodies that you want to. Obviously, you can only do this when the developers have scripted a conversation with a given dead character, but there's a ton of conversations with dead bodies that you can have using Speak with Dead, and some of them actually give you pretty interesting information. Mostly the mechanical benefits of talking with a dead character are minimal. You're more doing this for role-playing because most quests that have a Speak with Dead component can be solved in other ways. I can't offhand think of an encounter where Speak with Dead gives you a benefit that you can't get in a different way. But this is still a pretty helpful way to solve certain quests and accomplish certain things, and it can be very fun because the conversations with dead characters are often just very satisfying and fun to do. Speak with Dead, of course, there are lots of other ways to do this. You will be able to get a story-based power that lets you cast this for free. There's an amulet that can let you cast Speak with Dead. So you don't really need to know the spell, but it's also a ritual spell, so it doesn't cost you anything. If you're a character that can have this prepared, like a cleric, so you don't have to actually spend a spell known slot on it, then you can swap in Speak with Dead whenever you want to use it, and it's free to use. Most parties are going to have other ways to get this, and the mechanical benefits aren't strong, but Speak with Dead will still help in the situations where you want it, so I'm going to give it C tier. Next up, Spirit Guardians. Spirit Guardians is a cleric damage spell, and it works kind of differently from almost any other spell in Baldur's Gate 3. It's a damage aura that you place on yourself. So you cast it and you can concentrate on it for up to 10 turns. And then any enemy within 10 feet of you takes 3d8 radiant damage or 3d8 necrotic damage, you choose when you cast the spell, each turn with a wisdom saving throw for half. They take the damage both when you initially move next to them, and also if they end their turn in the radius. So you can sometimes double up damage on the same character multiple times in a single turn cycle and end up with additional damage. Also, very importantly, you can upcast this spell, and you do an extra 1d8 of the damage type you chose per level that you upcast it. So a 6th level Spirit Guardians does 6d8 damage every single turn, which adds up to a ton of damage very quickly. There's a couple things that make this spell extremely strong. One is just the sheer damage output. It's easy to hit every enemy in an encounter with it, sometimes multiple times per turn, and all that takes is your movement, so you can do other stuff while you're doing Spirit Guardians damage, including having cast Spirit Guardians before the fight starts, so it often doesn't take an action to use the spell at all, meaning making it basically free other than taking your concentration and the spell slot, but in terms of action economy, you can keep casting commands or glyphs of warding while you're running around doing Spirit Guardians. Secondly, the existence of command and glyph of warding makes this spell an incredible choice for concentration on damage, because a commanded enemy is just going to be stuck in the Spirit Guardian's damage for multiple turns in a row. So you can use some of your best tools, and they all synergize extremely well with one another when you're playing a cleric and using this spell. Your actions, your non-concentration actions, are so good that concentrating on this spell both empowers those actions and also means that you are doing the most powerful thing that you can every single turn. Upcasting Spirit Guardians is just the gold standard for cleric damage, and most clerics are going to be using all their spell slots of level 3 and higher, or not all of them, but a lot of their spell slots of level 3 and higher on Spirit Guardians in most fights throughout the game. The fact that you can choose either Radiant or Necrotic damage mostly doesn't matter, though there are some fights where Radiant damage is bad for whatever reason, and maybe you want Necrotic damage there. If you're a Death Cleric, enemies can't resist the Necrotic damage that you're doing, so Death Clerics may want to choose Necrotic for Spirit Guardians. Most characters are going to choose Radiant almost all the time. Because it is radiant damage, there's a tremendous amount of synergy. It works with radiating orb effects, which you can stack up extremely quickly because you can just walk next to an enemy with Spirit Guardians, and then when they begin their turn, they'll take extra damage. You can instantly stack them up to 10 radiating orbs before they ever get to act. So Spirit Guardians can work extremely well with the radiating orb set. Also, of course, the 10-foot radius of the Spirit Guardians is the same as the 10-foot radius of the Luminous Armor, which will obviously provide a ton of synergy, allowing you to stack the additional radiating orbs on enemies even more easily. Between providing incredible amounts of debuffs and doing excellent turn-over-turn damage, basically for free because you don't usually have to spend an action on activating Spirit Guardians at all, this spell was already incredible. It got even better in patch 8 because Death Clerics can use the necrotic version for good value, and it's also available to Oath of the Crown Paladins. Having this spell on a Paladin is incredible because Paladins already want to be next to enemies. They have really high saving throws, so they're going to maintain concentration on this spell much more easily. And you can use the Sentinel feat to keep enemies trapped inside the Spirit Guardians and so on. So for an Oath of the Crown Paladin, this spell is also just absolutely absurd, even though you don't get it until level 9. Already was an incredible spell and was S tier even before that, but patch 8 gave this already absurdly strong spell even more uses. S tier for Spirit Guardians. This is another one where you can build entire builds around it. Bards may want to take this from magical secrets, depending on what you're doing with that particular character. And most clerics are going to be using this to debuff enemies to the point where they can't fight back. Just an incredible spell that's going to see an amazing amount of use. Next up, Stinking Cloud. It's too bad that my cat isn't in my office right now because he's an expert on this spell. Stinking Cloud is a battlefield control spell with a 20-foot radius, so similar in size to Hunger of Hadar, Plant Growth, and so on, that lasts for 10 turns and requires your concentration. Enemies inside the Stinking Cloud have to make a Constitution saving throw or become nauseated, which entirely prevents them from acting, though doesn't provide any of the other incapacitation benefits. They don't get prone, so you don't get advantage on attacks against them and so on, but they just can't act at all while nauseated. Obviously, an incredibly powerful debuff. This is a spell with a very high upside. If you can keep enemies trapped inside of it and they fail the saves, then they're going to continuously lose their actions and be unable to do anything at all. But unfortunately in Baldur's Gate, there's a couple things that hold this spell back from reaching its full potential, even though it's a large AoE disable spell, which normally would be incredibly good. Firstly, it's a Constitution saving throw, and that's the worst saving throw to target. Most enemies will typically have pretty high Constitution saves compared to their other saving throws, so you're going to land this less reliably than you will land something like Hypnotic Pattern or Fear, which target wisdom saves, or Sleet Storm, which targets dexterity. Dexterity is also a little bit harder to land usually, but there are enemies with low dex saves and very few with low con saves. The second and perhaps more severe issue with this spell is that enemies who are immune to poison are immune to the effects of Stinking Cloud, and enemies with advantage on poison saves have advantage on the saving throw against it. Like half of the enemies in Baldur's Gate are immune to poison. This is a game where one entire act is about fighting undead, one entire act is about fighting robots and demons and outsiders and aberrations, and basically everything in the game that is a threatening encounter that's not a humanoid is immune to poison and will completely ignore the effects of Stinking Cloud. Even some of the humanoid enemies who wouldn't normally be immune to this have poison immunity for whatever reason. So a lot of enemies are simply going to ignore the effects of this spell. Even against the enemies that it can work against, they're going to succeed against the save more often, most of the time, than they would against another control spell, because it's a Constitution saving throw, and some enemies also have advantage on saves against poison for various reasons. So they may have advantage on the save as well. So the save DC on Stinking Cloud is just going to end up in practice being lower than you want. And it also allows enemies a lot of immunities. For that reason, it's only useful in a few encounters. When it's good, and if you can trap an enemy inside of Stinking Cloud using something like Plant Growth or Spike Growth to keep them in place and so on, then you can get a lot of stuns out of this, but it is very rare that this spell actually works the way you want to. It's too bad, because I really want to like this spell. It's extremely powerful in tabletop, but Baldur's Gate 3 just has way too many enemies who are immune to the effects, so I'm going to give it C tier, though this is a C tier where when it's good, it actually is quite good. Vampiric Touch. Vampiric Touch is a melee range damage spell. It does 3d6 necrotic damage, and you get half of that as healing. So it'll do an average of 10.5 damage, and you'll get an average of 5.25 healing in melee range. Each turn for 10 turns, or as long as you maintain concentration on the spell, you can spend your action on recasting this without spending a spell slot, so you can keep using Vampiric Touch over and over again throughout the encounter, if for some reason you want to waste every single action in an encounter. You heard right at the beginning why this spell is trash. The numbers are simply not there. 10.5 average damage is horrible, even if you get an automatic critical hit or something, because this is an attack roll, so you can critically hit with it. It's still not comparable damage to any other damage spell, and the healing is extremely minimal. If you want to heal and do damage on the same turn, cast a spell and use a fireball and drink a potion in the same turn. Don't waste your time with Vampiric Touch. This spell doesn't do anything particularly exciting, and the things that it does extremely badly because the numbers are just extraordinarily poor. D tier for Vampiric Touch. And finally, Warden of Vitality. Warden of Vitality is a paladin spell, so it's only available once you hit level 9 if you're a paladin. And how it works is you spend your action and then get to cast each turn for 10 turns a bonus action healing effect. This healing effect only takes your bonus action and heals for 2d6 with a 30-foot range. So it basically gives you a souped-up healing word that you can cast every turn for 10 turns. Although this spell takes your action to activate, you can, of course, cast it before combat starts, and it doesn't require your concentration, so you can use this while concentrating on something else, and then have a pretty solid healing bonus action each turn for 10 turns after that. Obviously, that's only helpful if the fight is going to go long already, so a lot of parties that intend to end fights on the first or second turn won't get any value out of Warden of Vitality. But if you're a party that has lower damage output and is more defensively oriented, Warden of Vitality can add up to a decent amount of healing. Like other healing effects, of course, it can apply the buff on heal items, which are very powerful. But for a paladin, spending a level 3 spell slot on this for a little bit of healing, paladins probably are not going to be using the buff on heal items mostly. That'll be on another member of your party probably, is just not a great trade. Where Warden of Vitality does shine, though, is when taken by a lore bard as a magical secret. Magical Secrets lets you get this spell at level 6 instead of at level 9 if you're a lore bard, which is obviously much earlier, so you'll be able to build around this spell for a much larger portion of the game. And when you build around this spell, the strategy is actually pretty good. If you use the Helmet of Grit or levels in Thief Rogue to get an additional bonus action, then you can use Warden of Vitality multiple times in a turn, which is starting to add up to a lot of healing. Add dedicated healing gear, levels in Life Cleric, and things like that, and Warden of Vitality can pass out a truly absurd amount of healing over the lifespan of the spell. Casting this one spell can bring your entire party back to full health outside of combat, which isn't that important in Baldur's Gate, but is kind of nice, but can also give your party a tremendous amount of sustainability during combats. So a character that is built around Warden of Vitality, a dedicated healer build, can use this spell to pretty good effect. That's the only character that wants to use this spell, and you can look up various versions of that build that I've done under the best healer in Baldur's Gate 3 if you want to know more about that build. And that build will use Warden of Vitality to tremendous effect, but just by default, this isn't a spell that you should usually lean into. For a paladin, this is mostly going to be a waste of a 3rd level spell slot that could have been a smite, and for a non-lore bard, you get it too late in the game to effectively build around it. Even for a lore bard without the levels in Thief Rogue and Life Cleric and so on that make this a powerful option, and potentially like Star Druid, stuff like that, you are not going to get a lot of value out of this spell. But if you do build specifically around maximizing this spell, it can be pretty good. It's kind of similar to Witch Bolt in that way, in that for most characters who are casting this, it's not great, but for one specific character who builds around maximizing it, it's excellent. For that reason, I'm going to give it C tier, because it really only works in one dedicated build, but there is one build that does a great job with Warden of Vitality. Alright, my friends, that is the 3rd level spells, and you can see why it's such a massive power spike to hit level 5 and get access to all of these spells. Let me zoom in and move my cursor here for those of you who want a clean screenshot. The S tier spells in this list are just absolute game winners. These are just incredibly powerful, and the A tier spells also have some of the most powerful control effects in the game, as well as one of the best damage dealing spells in the game in the form of Lightning Bolt. I would be fairly happy with a version of this list that moved Fear, Hypnotic Pattern, and Sleet Storm all to S tier. They're kind of in A tier as a quirk of the fact that there's 3 more or less duplicates of the same effect, so you won't be using any given one of them in every encounter, but all of these are extraordinarily powerful effects. Even when you drop down to B tier, there are some spells that you're going to be using all the time, things like Slow and Plant Growth. And even in C tier, there's a lot of build-arounds that work really well for certain character types like Crusader's Mantle and Warden of Vitality. So even as you go deeper in the tier list for 3rd level spells, although there's more niche spells here, there are still some spells that are going to be excellent in the right build or party composition. So 3rd level spells, just absolute bangers all the way through. And getting to level 5 to start casting these spells makes the game vastly easier. As always, of course, if you think that there's something that I put in the wrong tier, especially if there's a spell that I ranked too low in your opinion, let me know in the comments and give me some reasons why. I'm very interested in hearing how people have found uses for these spells, if there might be something that I overlooked. And of course, we've moved a lot of things compared to my previous version of this tier list, so I'm very happy to keep moving things around. As always, of course, if you've enjoyed the video, feel free to hit like and leave a comment. Helps me out with the algorithm. I think you can also now hype the videos. YouTube has added that. I genuinely don't know what it does, but YouTube loves it when you click buttons. So click every button you can. I would appreciate you taking the time to do that. Of course, you can also subscribe to my channel. We'll be back with the 4th, 5th, and 6th level spells, as well as other Baldur's Gate 3 build guides and other strategy game analysis. Cheers, my friends. I'll catch you next time.